night started with a game. A game that wasn't supposed to be anything more than a way to pass the time. But by the time I realized what was really happening, it was too late to escape. I should have known something was off the moment she suggested it. Jessica, my wife, had always had a tendency to push boundaries, to make our nights more exciting with little games. They were always harmless, at least at first. Pretend scenarios, little twists on reality. But this time, her eyes gleamed with something different. Something darker. I remember the evening clearly. The way the fading sunlight filtered through the window, casting long shadows across our living room. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of old wood and stale coffee. We had been sitting on the couch, watching TV, when she turned to me with a strange smile playing at the edges of her lips. "I think it's time we take things to the next level," she said. I chuckled at first, brushing it off as one of her usual quirky ideas. She always had these creative sparks, things she thought would keep our relationship fresh. At first, I enjoyed it. Who wouldn't? It was a little bit of fun, an escape from the mundanity of our daily lives. But this time, something about her tone felt different. She handed me a small black envelope. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just open it," she replied, her voice carrying an odd excitement. I slid my finger across the top, tearing the paper open. Inside was a sheet of paper, simple, with handwritten instructions. It looked like a set of rules for a game, though it felt more like a ritual. I skimmed through it quickly, trying to grasp what she was getting at. The more I read, the more uneasy I became. "We are going to play a role-playing game tonight, but this time, you need to forget everything you know about our usual games. This is different. This is real." The words seemed to blur on the page as I read them. My heart began to pound in my chest. I glanced at Jessica, but she was staring ahead, unblinking, her face strangely calm. "You're serious about this?" I asked, unsure whether to laugh or call it off right there. "Dead serious," she said. "It'll be fun, I promise." I could see the way her fingers twitched, a barely noticeable movement that betrayed her calm demeanor. There was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, a gleam of anticipation, as if she was waiting for something to happen. I didn't want to look like I was afraid, so I nodded. "All right, let's do it. What's the first rule?" Jessica smiled, leaning in closer. "The first rule is simple. Once we start, we don't stop until the game ends." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just nerves. It was only a game, after all. But as I glanced at the paper again, my eyes were drawn to one final line at the bottom. "If you try to leave before the game is over, there will be consequences." Her voice broke through my thoughts, pulling me back to reality. "Let's start." We moved to the dining room where she had set up the game, a strange board that I had never seen before. It wasn't the usual Monopoly or Scrabble. This board had odd symbols etched into it, symbols that I didn't recognize. It looked almost like something from an old occult book, ancient and foreign. The pieces weren't the usual pawns or dice either. They were something more visceral. Small, smooth black stones that seemed to absorb the light around them. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten as she positioned the pieces on the board, her hands moving with a precision that was too deliberate, too calculated. "Tonight's game is simple," she said, her voice low and measured. "You're going to take on the role of a man trapped in a haunted house, and I will be your guide. You'll follow my instructions, and together, we'll navigate the horrors waiting inside." The way she said it made me uncomfortable. The word horrors hung in the air like a heavy fog. I forced a laugh, trying to dispel the creeping dread that was slowly seeping into my chest. "Haunted house, huh?" I said. "This sounds like something out of a movie." Jessica didn't smile. She simply nodded, her eyes locked on mine, a gaze that seemed to pierce through me. "Just follow the rules, and you'll be fine," she said. "Remember, this is more than just a game." The game began, and as we moved forward, the boundaries of reality started to blur. I was playing my role, but something didn't feel right. The house, the one we had created in our minds, began to feel too real. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep within the house, not from the corners of our living room. And Jessica, she was different. Her usual playfulness had shifted into something colder, something far darker. She would glance at me with those wide eyes, as if she were watching me, studying my every move. The first haunting occurred about an hour into the game. Jessica told me to explore the house, a simple task that seemed harmless enough. I walked through the kitchen, past the dining room, and into the hallway where the lights flickered as I passed under them. I felt it, a chill in the air that wasn't there before. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. A shadow moved in the corner of the room, just out of the corner of my eye. But when I turned, nothing was there. Just your imagination, I told myself, trying to shake it off. But as I stepped into the hallway, I felt the walls close in around me, the space growing narrower, darker. The oppressive feeling of being watched lingered in the air. And when I turned around, Jessica wasn't standing where I had left her. The living room was empty. I called out her name. No answer. My heart raced as I checked the other rooms, but she was nowhere to be found. Panic started to crawl up my spine. The house felt wrong, the sounds were all wrong, and as I stood there, unsure of what to do, I heard her voice, soft and distant, coming from the shadows. "Come find me." I whipped around, but there was no sign of her. The air was still, dead still. "Jessica?" I called out, my voice trembling. But there was no response. I began to panic, stumbling back toward the living room, the sounds of my footsteps echoing in the empty house. I needed to get out. I needed to end this before it went any further. And then I saw it. The door to the basement, which had always been locked, was now ajar. A dark, inky blackness spilled from the crack in the door, stretching across the floor like something alive. I didn't want to go in. My body screamed for me to turn and run, but I knew it was part of the game. I had to play my role. I had to find her. I hesitated for a moment, my breath shallow, my mind racing. And then, slowly, I stepped forward. As I descended into the basement, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in front of me, and the darkness seemed to press against my skin like it was alive. I could hear faint whispers, low, indecipherable murmurs coming from the shadows. And there, at the far end of the basement, standing in the pitch black, was Jessica. But she wasn't Jessica anymore. She stood still, her face hidden in shadow, her hands clenched at her sides. "Come closer," she whispered, her voice a low, rasping sound. Something in her voice sent a jolt of ice through my veins. It wasn't her voice, not anymore. And as I took a step closer, I saw it, her face. It wasn't Jessica's face. It was twisted, contorted, a nightmare of gnarled features, hollow eyes staring back at me. I froze. My heart stopped. This was no longer a game. The first time I tried to wake up from the game, I realized there was no waking up. It had been a few days since I descended into the basement, since I saw her, that twisted version of Jessica that hadn't spoken a word since. I had tried to rationalize it. I had to. In order to survive. I kept telling myself it was just part of the game, just an elaborate trick she'd set up to spook me. But even in the back of my mind, I knew. The lines were blurred now. What we had started as fun had turned into something much darker. Something that had taken hold of her. And now, it was taking hold of me. When I finally climbed back up the stairs from the basement, Jessica was waiting in the living room, as if nothing had happened. She was sitting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes cast down. "How was your journey?" she asked, her voice smooth and calm, as though nothing had changed. She looked normal, the woman I had married. But there was a distance in her gaze, a flicker of something other behind her eyes. I couldn't finish my sentence. My heart was still racing. The image of her face down there in the basement, that face, was burned into my mind. I swallowed hard, trying to ground myself. "What the hell is going on, Jessica?" My voice was trembling now, barely above a whisper. "What did I see down there?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head, her lips curving upward just slightly. The same smile, the same look that had always been part of her, yet now felt wrong. "Shh," she whispered. "It's just a game, David. Remember? This is what we agreed on. You're just playing your part." I shook my head, backing away. "This isn't a game anymore. I hesitated, the words sticking in my throat. "You're not the woman I married." Her smile faltered, but she didn't seem angry. She wasn't even upset. There was nothing but calmness in her eyes, like a predator who had already caught its prey and was simply waiting for the inevitable. "You're wrong," she said softly. "I am exactly the same. You're the one who's changing." The room felt colder. The air thickened, and it seemed like the shadows on the walls were growing longer, darker. I didn't know how to explain it. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream. But I stayed frozen, held in place by her words, by the unsettling way she was looking at me. "David," she continued, standing up now, her movements slow, deliberate. "This game is more than just a way for us to connect. You've crossed over into something bigger. Don't you feel it? The pull? It's not just me, you see, there's something else, something that's been watching us." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "And it wants you too." My stomach lurched. The house seemed to groan, as though it was alive, responding to her words. I wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but I felt powerless. What was happening to me? What was happening to us? I tried to leave. I had to. I had to escape. I turned for the front door, but when I reached for the handle, it wouldn't budge. My hand gripped it with force, but it was locked from the inside. I jerked on it harder, panic rising in my chest. I pulled, yanked, but the door wouldn't give. It was like the house itself was rejecting me, like it knew I was trying to escape. I backed away, breathing heavily. "What the hell is going on?" I screamed, my voice shaking with fear and confusion. Jessica stepped closer, her face now inches from mine. Her breath was cold, sharp against my skin. She looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Predatory, not loving. She wasn't my wife anymore. I could feel it in the way her body moved, in the way she spoke, as if she wasn't quite human, as if she was something else entirely. "I told you," she said, her voice a low murmur. "This isn't just a game. We're past that now. The game has begun, David, and you're the one who's playing." Her words echoed in my mind. "We're past that now." The thought hit me like a slap to the face. What had I done? What had we done? We had crossed a line, and I didn't know how to return to the other side. Whatever force had taken hold of Jessica, it had taken hold of me too, and it was too late to back out. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Jessica was in the room, lying next to me. But it wasn't the same. Her breathing was too steady, too controlled. It was as if she had become part of the darkness itself. Every noise seemed amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the sound of the wind outside howling through the trees, the subtle ticking of the old clock on the wall. Each sound reverberated in my skull, growing louder, more insistent, like a countdown to something I couldn't escape. I turned my head to look at her. She was facing the wall, her back to me. Her hair fell across her shoulders like a veil, hiding her face. It was too quiet. "Jessica?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't answer. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but the instant my fingers brushed her skin, I felt it, an overwhelming coldness. It wasn't the coolness of the night air, it was something deeper, something colder than anything I had ever experienced. I recoiled, my breath catching in my throat. Her head snapped around, her eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, locked onto mine. There was no warmth in them, no recognition, just the deep, dark emptiness that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. "You shouldn't have touched me," she whispered. "Now you'll never leave." I scrambled away from her, my heart pounding in my chest. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted, my voice cracking with desperation. But she just smiled, that same twisted smile. "The game has begun, David, and you've already made your first move." The days bled into one another. Time lost its meaning as the world outside seemed to slip away. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. The walls of the house seemed to close in around me, and I started to notice things I hadn't before, small details that shouldn't have been there. There was always a shadow following me, just out of sight, a shape that lurked in the corner of my vision. It wasn't a person, but it was there. Every time I looked away, it grew closer, as though it was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Jessica had stopped pretending. She didn't hide the fact that she was no longer the person I'd married. The woman I had known had vanished, replaced by something darker, something more sinister. She didn't even need to speak anymore. Her presence was enough. And then one evening, I walked into the kitchen to find her standing at the counter, her back to me. Her hair was messy, her clothes stained with something dark. She was holding something in her hands, an old, brittle book that looked as though it had been ripped from the pages of a history that had never been written. "What is that?" I asked, my voice hoarse. She didn't turn around. "This is the final step," she said, her voice distant. This is how we make it permanent." My heart sank. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. "What is this game?" She finally turned to face me, her eyes gleaming with that same strange knowing look. "This game isn't just about us, David. It's about what comes next. About who comes next." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A deep dread filled my chest, settling into my bones. I knew deep down that I had made a terrible mistake. This wasn't some twisted role-playing game anymore. It had become something much worse, and there was no way out. I woke up to an empty house. The absence of Jessica was the first thing I noticed. The silence in the air was suffocating, as though the world outside had ceased to exist entirely. I reached over to the other side of the bed instinctively, but it was cold. The space where she should have been was vacant, untouched. I didn't know if I was relieved or terrified, but something in my gut told me this was no ordinary morning. I stumbled out of bed, my feet heavy on the floorboards as I walked toward the kitchen. My mind was still foggy from the nightmare that clung to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, the one that didn't belong to the woman I had married. That twisted thing in the basement. But the worst part was how it felt real, more real than any dream. It felt like the beginning of something inevitable, something that was unfolding regardless of how hard I tried to resist it. I opened the kitchen door, and there, at the table, was Jessica. But it wasn't Jessica, at least, not entirely. She was sitting in the same place she always sat, but she was different. Her skin looked pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide open, fixed and unblinking. She didn't greet me. There were no familiar words, no signs of warmth or recognition. She simply stared. "Jessica?" I said her name cautiously, stepping closer. I wanted to reach out to her, but my body was rooted to the floor. A feeling of dread washed over me. Her lips curled upward, but the smile that spread across her face wasn't her own. It was the same twisted grin I had seen in the basement, only this time, it was wider, more unsettling. She cocked her head, slowly, and then her voice emerged, hollow and distant. "It's too late, David," she whispered, and I could feel the words vibrating in my chest. "You've already made your choice." My breath caught in my throat. "What do you mean? What's happening to you? To us?" Her lips parted further, and the sound that came from her mouth was not hers at all. It was guttural, like something deeper, older, and hungrier. It resonated with the walls of the house, echoing into the empty corners like a chant. "You were warned," she continued, her voice now an eerie blend of both her own and something foreign. "You never saw it coming, did you? You thought it was all just pretend, but it's real now. You chose this." I staggered back, shaking my head. No, I didn't choose this. This wasn't the game, Jessica. This isn't you." But she wasn't listening. Her smile stretched even wider, the skin around her face beginning to crack, as though it were a mask that was beginning to tear apart. A low, rasping sound emerged from her throat, and for the first time since all of this had begun, I felt an overwhelming, suffocating fear. The kind of fear that claws at your insides, telling you that you are not in control. I backed away slowly, my hands trembling. The back door was just a few steps away. Maybe, just maybe, if I could get outside, I could escape. I could run. But when I reached for the door, it slammed shut on its own. The lock clicked into place, as though the house itself was a living, breathing thing that had made up its mind about me. I turned around to face her, but Jessica, or whatever she was, wasn't there anymore. The figure at the table had shifted, now standing. It was taller, broader, darker, and the features of her face had distorted further, becoming something unrecognizable. It wasn't just the physical form that had changed. She had changed. And with it, the very atmosphere around me had grown oppressive, heavy with a malevolent presence that clawed at my skin. The figure started to move toward me, slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall seemed to rattle the air. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but my legs refused to move. My body wouldn't listen. It was like I was rooted to the ground by some invisible force. "You can't escape," she hissed, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "There's nowhere left to run. You're part of it now. You've already crossed the line." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. The screen was black, unresponsive. No signal. Nothing. My hands shook violently as I dropped it to the floor. The house was closing in on me. I could feel the walls growing tighter, suffocating. I tried the windows, they wouldn't open. Each attempt made the feeling of being trapped more suffocating. The more I struggled, the more I realized this wasn't just the house. This wasn't just Jessica. This was something much worse. The game had always been a trap. It had always been leading me here, to this moment. There was no way out. I turned, finally making the decision to face what I had tried so desperately to ignore. It was time to confront whatever nightmare had taken over my life. The figure, no longer Jessica, was standing in the doorway to the hallway. Her eyes glowed now, faint, sickly yellow, and her grin stretched impossibly wide, as though her face were about to crack open. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Not vanished, not disappeared, but shifted, like she had melted into the air and reappeared somewhere else. It was then that I understood. She had never been human to begin with, not since the game had started. The game was never about pretending, it was about transforming, about letting whatever it was inside her claim us both, consume us whole. I didn't even hear her approach. One moment, the hallway was empty. The next, she was standing directly in front of me. The sound that escaped her mouth now wasn't words. It was a low, guttural growl that shook my very core. "You made your choice, David. You didn't believe me when I told you. But now you understand. You're mine. We're bound together, forever." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. But it was too late. It was already too late. Whatever power had taken hold of her, whatever force had been behind the game, it had already consumed us both. I was no longer the man who had once loved her, and she was no longer the woman I had married. I felt the coldness of her hand against my chest before I realized what was happening. It was an icy grip, a touch that sent a shock of pain straight through my heart. I gasped, my chest tightening, and then nothing. I couldn't breathe. My body locked up as if time itself had stopped. I knew what was coming. I had known it all along. I was never supposed to escape. There was no end to the game. There was no way back to who we were. And now there was only them, the ones who'd been watching, waiting all along. Jessica wasn't just a victim, she was the vessel, and I had become a part of it. The game was never meant to end. It had only just begun. As the world around me dimmed, as my consciousness slipped away into the darkness, I heard her voice one final time. "This is only the beginning. If you made it this far, I know you're hooked. But trust me, the scariest parts are still ahead." If you want to keep diving deeper into the unknown, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss another terrifying tale. And hey, if you've had your own creepy experiences, drop a comment below. I want to hear your stories. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, not every game is meant to be played.